Greetings, magical friends. I am the Desert Kitchen Witch, and today we will be cooking up some Thanksgiving magic as we center our hearts and minds on all of the blessings that we have in our lives. There is so much to be grateful for, and I love that this is the time of the year when people often pay more attention to gratitude. To make more of an effort to look around and marvel at even the simplest things that we have. I am grateful for running water and open skies, for hands that work and lungs that take in fresh air, for hummingbirds at my window and the rainbow after the storm, for family and friends, for all modes of transportation that get us where we need to be. I am grateful for the roof over my head and the plants that I've grown, the foods that I've made, and the music that I sing. The list can go on and on once you really stop to think about it. But in times when life is hectic, it's easy to lose sight of the big picture. I decided to make a clay medallion to wear as a reminder to stop, take a breath, and be thankful for something around me. This can be any shape or size that works for you. Use air-dry clay and decorate it with symbols, sigils, or just any design that feels right. A nice thing about air-dry clay is that it's porous, and once dry, it would also absorb essential oils if you choose to add aromatherapy to the necklace. Once I made my shape, I allowed it to dry for a day before using it. I find it's a lovely way to help focus my mind and remind me of what is important. And now let's get into the kitchen and make the showpiece of this year's Thanksgiving dinner, a decadent mushroom Wellington. This Wellington will be filled with a mushroom duxelle, which is a classic French mushroom spread full of earthy umami flavor. I will also be using portobello mushrooms, which add kind of a meatiness to the dish. Mushrooms are most often associated with growth, the cycle of life, and transformation. Walnuts, also a symbol of transformation as well as wisdom and manifestation, will provide texture and nuttiness. Butternut squash, a vegetable associated with harvest abundance and protection, will add a little bit of sweetness for contrast to the savory mushrooms. Sautéed spinach, known for strength and for taking action towards manifestations, along with sautéed garlic for protection and healing, will add their own earthy goodness to the dish. I started by smoke cleansing my workspace with cinnamon. This dish will have many components that will need to cool before making the Wellington. First will be the mushroom duxelle. I coarsely chopped some shallots and put them in the food processor. I added half of the mushrooms, coarsely chopped, to the same food processor. For this batch, I wanted the pieces to be small, almost like a chunky pâté. After removing the first batch, I added the rest of the mushrooms to the food processor and just processed a few times to make sure the pieces were bigger than the first batch. It will help create more of a texture for the final dish. And while I'm chopping mushrooms, the walnuts can go in the oven to toast for roughly 8 to 10 minutes, or just until you smell the toasted walnut fragrance. Set them aside to cool. I then turned my attention to the butternut squash. I peeled and sliced up the solid end of the squash, reserving the other half for another purpose. You can use a potato peeler to remove the outer layer, but I chose simple cuts to make the process faster. I cut the squash into thick slices, and I let them roast in the oven roughly 15 minutes until they were tender cooked and a little bit toasty on top. While the butternut squash was in the oven, I prepped my portobello mushrooms. I want these mushrooms to be fully in contact with the pan, so I cut the overhanging areas off and added that to the chopped mushrooms in the food processor. I added a little olive oil and placed the portobellos in all at once, knowing that they would shrink significantly as the water evaporated. I added a little bit of salt and a sprig of rosemary. It added such a fragrance to the dish. I flipped the mushrooms over a few times to caramelize and then set them on a cooling rack with the underside facing down so that the excess moisture could continue to drip out if necessary. Our Wellington needs to be fairly dry because the puff pastry can't tolerate a lot of moisture. So back to the same pan, I added a little more olive oil and then put in the first batch of the extra finely chopped mushrooms. It's important to do the mushrooms in batches so that the mushrooms have a chance to release their water and caramelize, otherwise they will just be soggy. I added a sprig of rosemary and a little bit of salt and pepper. It takes a while for the mushrooms to release their water and become a little toasty. Once that batch was done, I set it aside to cool, and then I added the larger chunks of mushrooms to the pan again with olive oil, salt, and pepper. Once they had reduced and caramelized, I added the first batch of mushrooms back to the pan and the toasted walnuts. I added a little more olive oil, red wine, and a bit of soy sauce for extra umami. I continued cooking until all of the flavors really melded together. I then took out the mushroom mixture and set it aside to cool. Next, I chopped garlic and added it to the same pan with a little olive oil, stirring to toast up the garlic. I then added handfuls of spinach with a little bit of salt. An entire bag of spinach cooks down to just one handful. I removed it to let it cool completely. I used my homemade puff pastry, but you can buy it in the store. Most of the time they are vegan. Before adding the Wellington ingredients, I first made a sigil for the health of my family for this Thanksgiving. I used ground sage and rosemary plus a little bit of water, and I used a clean paintbrush to mix it all together into sort of an herb paint. I then painted the sigil on, one brush stroke at a time, while thinking of the health and happiness of my family. I then started with one layer of the mushroom duxelle, about half of the mixture, followed by the sautéed garlic spinach. I packed each layer down to make sure there were no pockets of air. I added a few slabs of the butternut squash, followed by the portobello mushrooms, with a little bit of extra mushrooms on each side to keep it level. And then another layer of butternut squash, and then the last layer of the remaining mushroom duxelle. I pat it firmly so that it's very compressed, and then gently folded the puff pastry over one side. I used a little bit of my herb water to act as a sealant. I lifted up the pastry to wrap around the Wellington and then pressed down the seam in the middle to close it. I then tucked under both ends of the Wellington to fully seal it. And then I scored the puff pastry. You can really use any design of your choice here. Mine was just a very simple, classic design, but you can really get fancy with it if you want. Then set it in a preheated oven for about 45 minutes or until golden brown. If only you could smell this dish. It's a little drab in color, but it is such an amazing aroma that's just filling my kitchen right now. It's such a festive aroma of herbs and the mushrooms. It just makes it feel like Thanksgiving. The puff pastry has a nice crust on the outside that's flaky and tender. The inside cross-section showcases the richness of these mushrooms, too. The butternut squash has caramelized and become creamy. The spinach is tender and garlicky. The walnuts add such a delightful texture, and the portobellos add a tender meatiness to the dish. If there ever were a dish perfect for red wine, I believe this would be it. And then moving on to a simple dessert that could be many small bite-sized snacks or one 9-inch pie. This is my recipe for a vegan baked pumpkin cheesecake. Anytime I serve it, it is a hit. Simply place oil, oat milk for calming and resilience, cashews that have been soaked on a counter for a few days, changing the water daily until they become a little bit cultured and pleasantly tangy. Magically speaking, cashews are associated with abundance and money spells. I blended these ingredients until completely smooth, then I added cornstarch, lemon juice to ward off negative energies, vanilla extract for love, a little bit of salt, cinnamon and pumpkin pie spice for protection, and tofu for strength. I pureed until completely smooth before adding pumpkin for abundance. I pureed again to incorporate. I used a little bit of store-bought puff pastry dough that I had left over from a different project so that I could just make a few mini pies to show you. The rest are being made in time for my own family's Thanksgiving dinner. We have essentially made the filling for a pumpkin cheesecake, and at this point you can either pour it into one 9-inch pie shell and bake it as a single regular-sized cheesecake, or you can cut out small rounds of puff pastry to make a few mini snacks for you and your kiddo right before you go to bed. You know, just to try it out. I poured the pie filling into the little puff pastry crusts and baked for about 15 minutes. They will be very puffed up at first, but they will shrink back down as they cool. If you bake this as one whole pie, it will not puff up so much when it bakes, and after it's chilled, it will be the dense, creamy consistency of cheesecake. And now for the cross section. It's creamy, the pastry is perfectly cooked, and it's flaky. The rich flavor of pumpkin comes through, and the spices. This is the perfect 2 or 3 bite snack. It's basically like an elevated pumpkin pie. Thank you for spending some time with me today, and I hope you will recreate some of these dishes for your holiday gatherings. I know the cheesecake will be your new favorite. And so, as I close out another video, I'd like to tell you how grateful I am that you have found my channel, as it's still very new. I appreciate every comment, every view, and every like. I hope to see you again for more witchy cooking. Have a wonderful holiday season. With love from my magical kitchen to yours, the Desert Kitchen Witch. Blessed be.